Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first webinar of the Recipes Research Network. We're delighted to have you all join us today, and we're even more excited about the chance to share some of the exciting research that's coming out of this network's many amazing faculty and students. As we're starting today on the network, just a few notes about the logistics. If you'll go to the next slide. We are asking that everyone stays muted. We do have real-time captioning enabled, and there's that can be turned on your individual Zoom view. We're recording the webinar, and we'll share this out with all participants who registered afterwards. And we'll be taking questions and over the course of the session in the chat, and there'll be a chance to pose these questions at the end of the webinar to the speakers. So as a bit of introduction about this research network, this is a project that was recently funded by the National Science Foundation with an aim of creating knowledge and actionable solutions to solve food waste challenges. Next slide. And the inspiration behind this grant is the transformation of food systems from linear, wasteful, resource-intensive systems to those that are regenerative, circular, and benefit social, economic, and environmental outcomes. We're doing this through convergent, collaborative research that engages researchers, students, and partners across 14 different universities and 40 organizations. And the primary goals of this research network are to first understand where food is being wasted and what amounts, and then determine what solutions best fit for that in certain regions and how these solutions can be realized with partners across the United States. And it's this first motivating research question that drives the webinar today, which is being presented by some of our colleagues here at Ohio State. The two speakers today, we're going to be led off with Dr. Brian Rowe, who is one of the co-principal investigators, along with myself and 3 other faculty from other universities on the team. And he's the leader of the data and methods cluster of the Recipes Research Network. His research is on agricultural economics, specifically aimed at promoting reduction and redirection of food waste as part of a healthy and sustainable food system. And joining Brian today is Ran Lee, who's a PhD student in the Agricultural, Environmental, and Developmental Economics Department at Ohio State. And her research also focuses on economics, specifically experimental and empirical methods that aim to understand consumer food waste behaviors and specifically address nutrition, health, and food waste solutions. So with all of that said, thank you all again for joining us, and I'm going to hand it over to Brian and Ran for our webinar today.
Thank you, Callie. On behalf of Ran and many other colleagues who will talk about later, thanks for being at this webinar today. We're excited to talk to you about the Recipes National Household Food Waste Tracking Survey. Today, we'd like to give a bit of an overview of household food waste measurement approaches, talk about some of the strengths and weaknesses, particularly of self-administered surveys like the Recipes Tracking Survey, go into a little more detail about what the tracking survey does, and share with you some initial preliminary findings from the first 4 waves of data collection, which actually predate the beginning of our Recipes grant, but we look forward to seeing that information. And then we'll end with some opportunities for collaboration and convergence as we see the tracking survey as being a point for convergence and collaboration across the network and with potential others who may want to integrate or interact with the network. So when we think about household food waste measurement, there are many things that we would like to have if we were going to go about measuring this. And as we know, household food waste is a very large portion of overall food waste. And so it's a critical component to be able to identify and measure. We like that measurement approach to be accurate, so get the correct level, like for it to be precise or consistent as it's applied over and over again. We'd like it to be replicable, so different people can use it and come up with the same results. We'd like for there to be granularity, so lots of details about the waste, its disposition, so that we can understand perhaps some causal relationships. We would like those who are being measured to have low burden to participate in that measurement activity. And we'd like the implementation of that to be a low cost to the researcher or the community who might be measuring. And then, of course, we'd like it to be scalable so that we can do this over large geographic areas to understand trends throughout the United States and more broadly. If we think about a household perhaps wasting a number of items during the week, we recognize that some of those items are going to go into the garbage, but others might find other ways of discarding. There might be some recycling or composting going on of food, and some research by Angel Arroyo Rodriguez in his dissertation showed that about 11% of people in his national survey reported some type of composting. Some might feed it to a pet or other animals, and about 18% of people identified that as one method they use on a regular basis. And then, of course, we might have items going down to disposal or a sink. And again, a fairly large portion of people identify that as being one way that they deal with food waste. So thinking about that context, we can imagine several different ways of measuring this. One might be some type of diary where in pretty much real time, people document in their household where all these items are being, when they're being disposed, how much and where they go. Here's one example of a photo-based diary. Corby Martin, John Paulson, and myself have an app called Food Image, which helps undertake such diaries of documenting food waste. But there are other paper and pencil approaches or tablet approaches to doing this as well. Some features of this, it typically does have a high participant burden. You're there every time you waste food, you're interacting, and so it is a bit burdensome to the participant. And hence it's kind of costly to recruit. And then once you have the data, it's a lot of data. It can take some time and effort and energy to process it. It's also then hard to induce participation by those for longer durations because it is a bit intensive. But it can capture all the waste destinations as well as out-of-house behavior. So not just in the house, but perhaps at restaurants or food service. And it can be highly granular, capturing waste destinations, reasons, and household characteristics. Now, another approach might be to go with a retrospective survey, perhaps at weekly intervals at the end of the week. And people can then think back, remember items, and enter them into the survey. Lower participant burden, only one time, perhaps per week of entering data, hence less costly to recruit. And typically, if it's done online, the data processing steps are much easier. We know that there is a downward bias in this approach, and we'll talk a bit more about that in later slides, and hence lower accuracy. It can capture out-of-household behavior if the survey participants are directed to recall those events as well. And it can be highly granular, can capture waste destinations and reasons and household characteristics as part of the survey. Another approach might be some type of physical audit, curbside or otherwise. And so they might have a third party come in, and here there would be low participant burden if it's done curbside, and you basically don't have to do anything with your garbage. There are sometimes methods of this known as caddies, where the participant must separate and collect their own waste and put it into a separate bin that's then handed over to the researcher, and that can be a bit higher participant burden. It's very costly to implement, hire contractors to do this type of work or research assistants, a lot of traveling, a lot of gathering, a lot of counting. And it does miss items that go to compost, fed to animals, anything that doesn't get into the garbage stream. It can be pretty highly granular on those types of items put into the garbage stream, but may miss being able to document the causes of that because there's not necessarily any data collected about that. Finally, we can use indirect methods such as a mass balance approach, where food receipts might be gathered from a household, some information might be used through a model to determine their caloric needs. And by taking the expected calorie burn and deducting that from the food purchased during the food receipts, one can infer the amount of food not being eaten. So the burden here depends upon if the participant has already been collecting food receipts for another purpose. For example, large surveys like Nielsen oftentimes require survey participants to do this. It can be a bit more costly to model because it's a very specific modeling approach that might take some expertise. Participation in these panel studies like Nielsen or IRI are typically longer duration, so it does often bode well for longer duration. You may miss out on behavior that's occurring outside of the home as well. So the thing we're focusing on today are surveys, the National Tracking Survey. And some of the pros and cons for this is we do know that there is bias in these surveys due to simple forgetting. It's retrospective, and so earlier items in the week might be forgotten. There's also self-selection. Those who are willing to participate might have behaviors distinct from those who do not. People might remember, but just be inaccurate in their estimation of the amount that they wasted. And there may be some reactivity. People might react to the active measurement itself by wasting less or maybe reporting that they waste less. In fact, there's been some documentation of this. Here's some data from Tom Quested and some of his colleagues from 2020, where they looked back and at several studies where both a bin dig or a curbside audit was done, as well as a survey. And the height of each of these is a different study showing how much the underreporting was of the survey compared to the bin dig, the curbside audit, with a typical value being around 30 to 40% underreporting. But the participant burden and cost is typically going to be low compared to many other approaches. The granularity can be high, and it is scalable. It can be implemented widely online through typical online consumer panels, so some upsides there. There is some evidence for consistency, if not accuracy, of surveys. So Erica Van Herpen and her colleagues simultaneously implemented several methods on the same households. They did a weekly survey, very much similar to our tracking survey, diaries, a photo diary, and kind of a physical measurement of materials put into a kitchen caddy. And they found a very high correlation between the amounts reported on the survey and these other methods, though they did continue to document this bias, downward bias in the reporting from the survey. But they concluded that although there's underreporting, the strong correlation indicates that useful insights into household differences can still be obtained, holding out hope that surveys can be very fruitful for attacking certain questions. So taking a survey and appropriating it for a tracking purpose is and can be very important. It can provide, for example, nationwide system of measurement that can be used to assess national goals or progress from particular initiatives regionally or nationally. It can allow us to have a database to understand responses to natural experiments and phenomena like COVID or food price inflation. So long as we assume that the bias that we're seeing in the survey is consistent and not interacting with those phenomena. Surveys are also nice because they're done on a regular basis, and so you can add questions on waves, on particular waves that might address breaking issues and provide quick insights juxtaposed with the food waste measurements that are being added are constantly on the survey itself. For example, RAP in the United Kingdom has a tracking survey that they found very useful to understand what happened during COVID in the United Kingdom. Here you can see two different measures that they use. One is a percentage of 4 key products that respondents listed that they had wasted, the percent therein. And they noted a very large decline in that percentage in April 2020, right after COVID hit, and then a gradual kind of asymptotically moving back towards those pre-COVID levels as 2021 wore on. In terms of the recipes tracking survey, we turn back to Erica Van Herpen's work in 2019, her household food waste questionnaire. We adapt it to the US context by making sure we get units and terminology in a more US friendly terms. We did a pilot test of this and published it in 2021, led by my colleagues Ying Xu along with Katie Bender. And validated that with US households. The survey works through starting with a pre-announcement. We ask respondents to monitor their discards, including food composted or fed to pets over the next week. We ask them to focus on edible discards, so ignoring bones, pits, and peels. And then a week later comes the core survey after they've been given that heads up, and they mark the food categories with discards over the last 7 days. They choose amounts discarded from a list of categories. And they also just tell us the state of the food when it was discarded. Was it totally unused, unopened, etc. And then after the survey, we can calculate total weight of discards by using the data that was entered above. We ascertain for 20 plus food categories. So quite a lot of granularity in terms of the food categories. It's a bit overwhelming to show all these, but you can kind of see the level of granularity that's available in this domain. The quantity reporting part of the survey, they'll mark down which categories they have had discards in, and then they'll see something like this. So if they marked fresh vegetables and salads, they'll see this for the specific category, and will indicate how many cups of waste. Earlier, we give them a visual guide for how much a cup is, approximately a fist. And then we can impute quantities taken from the middle of these brackets. We then ask them which of those 4 categories did the discarded items fall into, allowing them to mark more than one. So back in November of 2020, we bootstrapped a pilot data test of this to validate the US version, provide some initial data for power calculations, test the sensitivity of certain wording and phrases. We were on a limited budget, so we focused on 2 different demographic groups that we knew to be quite different in their waste tendencies, a younger age group and an older age group. Typically, past work has shown that older waste less, and then small households and larger households, and typically larger households waste more in total, but less on a per person basis. We did this with 150 people and did 2 waves of follow-up measurements with about a 23% attrition rate at that time. We were able to replicate standard results from previous literature, so we did indeed, even with a small sample size, be able to find significant differences with older respondents wasting less than younger, and smaller households wasting less than larger on a total basis, and then flipping the sign for on a per person basis. We found that the instruction wording, when we changed that a little bit, the results were not sensitive to modest changing in particular wording categories. And then it allowed us to do some power calculations. And so we identified, for example, we need groups of about 240 respondents to identify a 25% change in reported waste at a 5% level of significance. So some good inputs. With that completed, we were then able to start the waves of data collection. Here we see one began in February of 2021, one in July of 2021, one in December of 2021 through January. We avoided major weeks of major holidays. Another in February, beginning in February of 2022. And then we've got a wave going on as we speak with final data still coming in. And then one planned pre-holiday here in October and November. In all the waves, we have a national sample recruited by a commercial online consumer panel provider. All demographic groups are included. We do post hoc weighting, that is to balance out, to make sure we've got a similar distribution on household size, age, and income. Even if a particular wave had a little bit more in one group and a little bit less in the other group, we'll post hoc weight it to make sure they're balanced. And all these have questions added on: the frequency of home meal preparation, assessment if their food waste was higher or lower than normal, and possible reasons why that might be the case, and some other questions to just document their behavior during the week of reporting. There were small experiments embedded during some of the waves. Here's an example of some of these things that we can also follow up in the future as well. But let's get to some preliminary results from waves 1 through 4. And here I'd like to recognize not only Ran, who will present some of the results here in a few minutes, but also Ying Xu, a graduate of this department and currently in China, about ready to take on an academic position, and Katie Bender at the University of Delaware for their work contributing to this. So here is part of the headline results. What we have here is the height of these multicolored bars is the total amount of grams per person per week discarded of one's edible food by each wave. We're giving the first month of data collection for each of these 4 waves. And so what we see here is from February of 2021 to the wave starting February of 2022, we see nearly a 3-fold increase in the amount of food reported as being wasted by our respondents. Not only was the increase large, but you can also see the confidence interval bar is also getting wider, particularly in February of 2022. So an increase in variability as well. The multiple colors in each bar represent 8 different subcategories of food types. And so you can see many of these subcategories are also growing through time, with that deep red fresh produce sub-bar showing some market increases, particularly in February of 2022. To put this in perspective, we can juxtapose this with the trends we saw in the United Kingdom for WRAP. Now, their data goes through October of 2021, and they, of course, documented that large decline after COVID and then recovery of waste percentages. We don't have percentages, we have actual grams of waste. And so it's a bit difficult to compare apples to apples here. But we also see, similar to them, their January to June increase was about 10%, and our February through July increase was about 10%. But then as we expand upon out beyond their time horizon into the deep winter of 21-22 and February of 2022, we do see that market increase. And again, if you look closely at theirs, they're looking at the percent wasted on the last occasion of bread, potatoes, milk, and chicken, all fairly perishable items. We're looking at all items, including some more storable and kind of long duration items that can be shelf stable as well. So things to consider as we try to contrast and these 2 sets of time trends. To put this in some other perspective, we can drill down into the recipes tracking data to try to understand what things might be correlating or associating with the increased waste in food. Here on the vertical of this graph, we've got our grams per person per week. And on the horizontal, what we have is the percent of households that reported for their reporting week that they prepared all their meals at home. And so we see a strong relationship here. All the way to the right in February of 2021, we had almost 30% of households saying that they had prepared all their meals at home. Tracking left and upwards, we see by February of 2022, between 5 and 10% of households reported preparing all their meals at home. So much more activity outside the household in terms of meals, with the December and July being part of the way there, both with respect to food waste and the percent of all meals being prepared at home. We also note that the meals prepared at home strongly related to their percent of time spent at home. It's almost a straight line in terms of the association. And if we dig down a bit further, we see the biggest effects of having all your meals prepared at home was that people typically wasted fewer drinks if they were preparing all their meals at home. Also, fresh produce was another category where that was very important. And of course, the total overall, here we're showing some figures from regression work, censored regression coefficients with bars with showing the confidence interval around those estimates. We were also able to ascertain if they had any issues during their reporting week that might have affected the amount of food that they threw away. And we have this for each wave, and we can see the blue bars, February of 2021, about 50% of people noted some type of issue. And then by February of 2022, almost 80% of people were reporting one of these issues, one or more of these issues. If we look into these, we can see some of the more notable ones is unexpectedly eating out. And we saw a bit of this preview before with eating all meals at home. About 10–12% of people noted this as an issue back in February of 2021, and this almost triples by February of 2022. So we're seeing a pattern here that there may be some strong relationships here between eating out of the home and the amount of food being reported as wasted in home. Another notable change between February of 21 and 22 is the expired bulk items. These are expired or excessive items from bulk or batch shopping that people discarded during their week of reporting. And we see that more than doubles between 2021, early 2021 and 2022. Perhaps this was the great post-COVID pantry purge of sorts that was happening here because it was fairly constant during the 3 waves in 2021. It might have been early spring cleaning. It's conjecture, but one can imagine that could be a feasible explanation for some households and worth looking into more detail. Some other findings from the regression analysis. We found several expected associations. So indeed, larger households wasted more in total, but less on per person, as we've seen before. Households with older members tended to waste less than households with younger members. We also found some notable null effects, that is, non-relationships, at least at significant levels. Education, income, region, ethnicity, the sex of the respondent, employment status. None of those were statistically significantly associated with the amount of waste, nor was the percent of time spent at home. But remember, we're controlling for the percent of meals also served at home. And having kids under 6, it had a large positive effects, but it was very highly variable. And so it didn't reach statistical significance despite it having a large average effect. Lots of people were very high, some were very low, and so on average it was insignificant. A couple of other significant findings that maybe not have been covered as much in the previous literature. We did find that those identifying as Black reported more waste, and that those who shop less frequently reported less waste. And particularly we have this contingent of people who were shopping about monthly, who tended to report a lot less waste than those shopping more frequently. All right, so that gives us some of the insights from comparing those first 4 waves. I want to bring to the screen here Ran Lee to talk a bit about some things that we're exploring moving forward with the tracking survey. Ran?
Yes, thank you, Brian, for sharing those exciting results with us. And I'm going to talk about how we want to move forward with a recipe food waste tracking survey. So our plan for now is to launch a pilot study on a different platform, which is Prolific. It is a platform for online subject recruitment which explicitly caters to the researchers. It is a valuable alternative to other crowd-working platforms, and it is superior in terms of transparency, functionality, and usability. So Pierre et al. In 2017 published a paper comparing the differences between the different online platforms, including the Amturk, Crowdflower, and Prolific, and also a traditional participant sample from the Center of Behavior Decision Research, and their results showing that prolific participants seems to be more naive to common experimental research tasks and offer a more diverse population in terms of the geographical location, ethnicity, etc. And both of papers advocating prolific as a better platform declare no competing interest, and Periodal in Periodal published another paper in 2021 comparing the overall data quality between the platforms and in terms of the attention, comprehension, and honesty and the reliability of the participants. And their results showing the prolific provide better data quality compared to other platforms. So we are going to launch a pilot study on prolific to assess the validity of this by ourselves first. Next slide, please. So the target sample of the recipe food waste tracking survey is to recruit a balanced sample amongst three demographics, including household size, age, and annual household income. Besides that, we also want to recruit the participants who are responsible for at least half of food preparation at home. And to get this target sample, there are two features we are going to make best of on prolific. The first is pre-screening and the second is post-screening. So pre-screening is when prolific participants sign up for the platform, they are asked to provide basic information which can be used to recruit the target audience for the survey. So those basic informations are including the household size, age, and annual household income. And for the customized criteria for your survey, you will have to propose your own question in a short survey and condition on the answers in their subsequent recruiting. Another good thing about publish a short survey asking them whether you are responsible for the food preparation at home is that you could acquire participant other demographic information such as sex, ethnicity, country of residence, and platform records such as total approvals and total rejections, besides the question you covered in your survey. Next slide, please. So the third feature, which is good on prolific, is that the option for inclusion and exclusion of individual participants. In other words, this is a screener allowing excluding specific prolific IDs to answer your survey. So in our food waste tracking survey, as I mentioned, we will publish a short survey asking respondents whether they are responsible for the food preparation at home. So by publishing this survey, we could only include those who answered yes ID in our survey. So only those included IDs could answer the following survey. And this is also a good feature when you have a baseline survey and a follow-up survey, such as our food waste tracking survey. We will have a pre-announcement to ask participants to monitor their food waste, and after 1 week, we will have another follow-up survey. This also gives the potential to a longitudinal studies, which is to gathering the information from the same ID, same subject at a different time.
Thanks, Ran, for covering some of these new directions that we're thinking about. And thanks for all your work on some of the key components of the survey so far. So you've now got kind of a glimpse of some of the initial results and some ideas of some of the capabilities that we may be able to pursue as we think about broadening out our methods for bringing participants into the survey. And want to talk about, some of the potential for further additions and directions we've been thinking about. But here's where we really want to reach out to network members and members of groups that might want to affiliate with the network to use the survey as a means for answering burning questions, developing ideas that can help us towards convergence as a network. One would be to move towards an explicit panel of respondents. At this point, with our current survey respondent provider, we are unaware if the people who are responding are repeats or one-off participants in those surveys. So we don't have a strong idea if the people from the February 2021 survey also responded in subsequent waves or not. They might be, they might not have, so we just don't know that. And obviously there are benefits and downsides of that. As somebody in the comments noted, if people participate once, that might trigger them to change their behavior. And we may have then participants who are treated, if you will, or have changed their behavior and might not be representative of the national population, might not have changed their behavior. But we could develop an explicit panel of respondents if we would like to, and if that serves the needs for answering key questions with Prolific, or if we go to other types of survey providers. Other things we can think about is the food categories, changing the number and classification of food categories. We have our current form with an eye towards keeping consistency with the initial work of Van Herpen and her colleagues, hoping out that we might be able to do some international comparisons with some of that past work to see how results compare across countries. But it might make more sense moving forward to maybe combine some categories, or maybe to divide up other categories. For example, there might be a strong motivation to break, say, milk out of drinks into its own subcategory, as that's an item that's oftentimes subject to waste due to its perishability. We could also then think about our method for measuring waste. Obviously, WRAP in the United Kingdom, as we've seen earlier, focuses on getting the percent of waste of key items. That's a different way to go than actually having a quantity measurement. In order to do that, we would probably have to do one of two things: either directly ask that, like WRAP does. It's a bit more cognitively involved, particularly if you have food categories where that are broad and might have multiple items, or food categories that might have a longer shelf life. And so people are asked to remember back perhaps weeks or months to when they purchased an item and estimate how much they've wasted. I think that's probably why WRAP keeps it to perishable items that were likely purchased fairly recently. Or we could ask them kind of a typical purchase amount for categories, and then we can do the calculation of percent. Benefits and downsides to doing this as well, but something we can think about. We could also think about testing particular messages for effect on subsequent behaviors, reports of waste, attitudes, by leveraging that panel capability that a platform like Prolific provides. I know there are hopes, I think, to stand up a national food waste reduction campaign focused on consumers, and we may have some capability to do that. Again, we'd have to be very thoughtful about then using those participants in later waves as kind of a representative person, because their behaviors may have changed long term. We can continue to keep testing the sensitivity of results to different question wording and formatting and choices of quantity brackets and things like this. That would be good science to keep doing that to make sure our results are robust. And we can ask more about away from home food behaviors. Given this seemingly strong association with eating out, maybe there's some avenues of questions there that could illuminate what's going on and some of the issues there. Some of the other obvious issues are Wow, February 2022, a huge increase over February 2021. Not encouraging from the trend that we were hoping for, that perhaps COVID brought food waste lower as it did in the UK, and perhaps we can keep lower levels of food waste. But there was an interesting bump in the amount of bulk purchased goods being discarded or seen as an issue for waste during February of 2022. And so it'd be very important to understand if this is going to be a one-time bump, maybe the great post-purge of COVID, and everybody looking at their shelf-stable items and deciding to get rid of some of those items, and maybe that portion of the additional waste might revert back to lower levels. Maybe February. So there's lots of competing hypotheses for what's going on with December and February of 2022, and if these will be bumps in the road or whether they'll be the new normal. And so there may be questions that could be added or approaches to be added to start addressing some of these issues. All right. We are at about 20 minutes remaining. So what I'll do is go through the chat and start answering questions. Please keep adding questions into here. I'll go back to the very first one from Carol Jones. Thank you, Carol. With diaries, are you capturing weight or volume? And so with the survey, we're allowing respondents to give us a volume, typically in cups. And then we are converting them to a weight in grams using kind of USDA averages for categories. Diaries, when people do diaries, oftentimes they'll provide a scale for some types of diaries. For our photo diary, we also convert to grams using expert judgment as they view those photographs. Part of the recipes research project is to automate that translation of photo diaries or increasingly automate the translation of photos of food into quantities and types of food. And so we're working on that. Jim Jones asked, does participation in the survey over time influence food waste behavior of participants? And so that's an open question. Other studies have shown just making people aware of this and making them conscious and having them do some type of measurement will oftentimes influence their behavior. So we do have a bit of a Heisenberg effect possibility here as well. And so that might be something that we can use some clever types of research designs to try to tease out the degree of that reactivity. Amber asks, does each wave include different participants? And again, I think we've talked about that briefly. We're not quite sure with our current respondent provider. And so with Prolific, we can track that more closely if we would find that pilot useful and adopt a platform such as that. Weslin asks, any questions around diet, vegetarian or omnivore? No, we did not ask that question. It seems like a logical one and probably a no-brainer that we should have added early on. So that's something we should probably mark down to add on to the next wave. It makes perfect sense to start looking at some of those associations between waste and the types of diets that people might be on. Some good linkages there. And we would look forward to any verbiage or questions that you would like specifically added onto the survey. Cheryl asks, any questions around the barriers people face that discourage them from engaging in food waste prevention behaviors? No, not in any of these waves. The main focus was on assessing the level of waste more than it was thinking about how they might reduce food waste and barriers, but that could definitely be an entire line of research into itself. That might be, survey might be useful for answering. Janet asks, could people have hoarded purchasing during the early months of COVID? And so I think that is a excellent hypothesis that could be tested with some retrospective questions on future surveys. Had we known that big bump were coming, we might have added that question in advance to the February 22 wave, but that's something we could ask retrospectively. Mary asks, it's a question publicly available. It's not posted, but it's definitely already coded in Qualtrics software and widely available. Actually, the questioner one version of it is probably as part of our Methods X paper where it was validated. So we do have the core questions available publicly online as part of the appendix of the Methods X paper that was referenced earlier in an earlier slide. And we're happy to share the Qualtrics coded version as well. Margarita asks, were there any questions in the survey about length of time since immigration to current country of residence? No, interesting. And that would be an interesting line of research to think about. And we look forward to maybe having some of those conversations as sidebars later on as well, and seeing kind of what hypotheses you have in that direction. Anna asks, is a report of the results of the survey available online? No, it's not gone through peer review yet. So we are currently preparing a manuscript that will be submitted for peer review in the near future. And so once that's completed, we'll most likely put up a preprint as it's going into peer review so that it can be available and noted as not having gone through external peer review yet. But we look forward to sharing that with you in the near future. Andrew asks, would you please speak more to the correlation with frequency of shopping? Is that also driving numbers of meals at home, or is there another covariance? Yeah, we think this is a fascinating area for more research. One of the conjectures that this group was tossing around is whether the people who shop monthly probably don't buy much perishable. And so perhaps they're eating maybe only frozen or canned produce and making their monthly Costco run or other type of bulk purchasing run. And so they may have distinct diets from those who are shopping weekly. And they may be ones who have schedules where they're traveling quite a bit and just don't find time to shop as well. So the meals at home might be covariant that way. We could look at that covariation with the data we have as well, and that might be something to focus on in future waves. Seung Hoon asks or comments, it's interesting that education or income had no predictive power for the waste quantity. Any explanations for that? Also, is this consistent with earlier works, if any? Yeah, the income one, I think those of us who have looked closely at this literature, we found some analyses that have found significant association between income and waste, and others that have not. It's not a consistently significantly significant correlate with waste. In fact, that was the judgment of the group that wrote the National Academies of Sciences panel study that I participated in as well. So it goes back and forth. Education also has never been a clear correlation that I'm aware of. So, but we wanted to make sure to see if there were correlations in this group. Alwyn asks, did you control for the food waste reducing behaviors such as using shopping lists, storage containers, meal planning? No, those are questions that we have contemplated adding in the near future. And so would be very open to a tight set of questions in that domain that would be useful to be added. Susan asks, when asking about frequency of shopping, is this in-person shopping versus online? And I think we have not actually asked them to distinguish whether it was online delivery or in person. And I think, again, something in retrospect that could have been an easy addition that we could have added onto that, but need to add on in the future. Thank you for that idea. And happy to partner with you on that if you have specific ways you want to break that out. Let's see here. Amber asked, how far into the future are you planning to continue the survey effort? We've got it budgeted for the 5 years of the recipes program. So this would take us through, trying to do the math, I believe through 2026. A lot of it will depend upon survey costs, if those go up more dramatically than we budgeted. So we may seek supplemental funds from other sources to try to make sure we've got adequate sample size for that duration, and then to extend it on as well. Pico asks, were you able to identify the amount, kind of food participants brought from food pantries and other food assistance programs? No, we did not ask questions of that ilk yet. But again, I think this is something that is something we could add. We probably would want to do an oversample of lower SES to make sure that we would get an adequate sample to be more precise with questions of that type if we're looking for that. But again, that's an excellent idea and a potential point of convergence that we can see between the survey and topics for the future. Right, I think we're at 3:51. I see no other questions. If somebody would like to ask more questions, please put them in the chat. Rand, do you have any thoughts or other things that you'd like to chime in with as well? You're so familiar with this data and have been in the trenches here working with the data. Any other thoughts that occurred to you as the presentation and questions went on?
I think those comments are very helpful. We do need to include some of those in our future surveys. So that's so helpful. Thank you.
Seeing no more questions, is there a question on Mike? Go ahead. Okay, if not, we look forward to any more questions you might have after the fact by email to myself, and I'll share those with Rand. And we look forward to collaborations to be able to use this for research that might be useful to you and your part of the research as part of the network, or if you're interested in interfacing with the network and using this as a potential point of collaboration. Rachel prompts us to sign up for the email list that she has put into the chat. And we look forward to another webinar on Monday, October 3rd. Details will be forthcoming soon, but we think it'll be a very engaging webinar. With that, Rachel, anything else, or should we go ahead and sign off?
Yes, I think that's everything. So thank you so much, Brian and Rand, and thank you everyone for joining us today.